This is Ken Mandel. I'm one of the, I'm the moderator for today. I direct the Computational Health Informatics program at Boston Children's Hospital. I'm a professor of biomedical informatics and pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. I'm thrilled to be moderating two panels today in this extremely important series on reducing provider burden, one of the key causes of physician burnout, well documented. And we're going to be first talking with experts, envisioning what the future might look like, problems and pitfalls with new solutions coming. And then we're going to actually hear from innovators about actual solutions that are being proposed and that are coming to market now. So I'm going to begin by queuing up our first panel. An incredible group of experts. When I look at this list of who we'll be talking to over this next hour on the panel, what is the job of documentation in the future? My name is the only one I don't recognize. So what we have here is, I'm going to introduce Jesse Ehrenfeld, the immediate past chair, Board of Trustees, American Medical Association, the Senior Associate Dean and a tenured Professor of Anesthesiology at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and Professor of Anesthesiology and Health Policy at Vanderbilt University. Molly McCarthy, National Director of US Health Providers and Plans at Microsoft. Marc Overhage, Healthcare Information Technology Executive, Indianapolis, Indiana, United States. Eric Topol, who of course needs no introduction, founder and director, Scripps Research Translational Institute, Executive Vice President, Scripps Research Institute, and Ross Koppel, Adjunct Professor, Sociology, School of Arts and Sciences, UPenn. So with that, I'm going to just let folks know the structure of our panel. I'm going to ask each panelist a question and give them 3 minutes to respond. So after about 15 minutes, I'm going to moderate a discussion with the panelists for 15 minutes, and then we're going to spend about a full 30 minutes on your questions for the panelists. So listen carefully, get your questions ready, put them in the chat, they'll be curated, and the participation of all folks on the Zoom is really going to be the most important part of this panel over the next hour. So I'm going to now ask Jesse Ehrenfeld, how is the AMA working to enhance the CPT coding system to reduce the documentation burden beyond what's already been accomplished with the E&M changes that took effect on January 1st? Tell us a little bit about those E&M changes, a big policy shift, and what AMA's role is going to be in helping us forward.
Well, great. Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me. This is such a delight to talk about this. You know, at the AMA, we've been focused for a while on how do we make technology an asset, not a burden, get more of our clinicians' time and attention back to our patients. And a big piece of that is obviously coding. So, you know, if you think about what characterizes E&M documentation today, you know, it's what has been a theme throughout this symposium, which has been great, by the way. Note bloat, copying and pasting leading to meaningless data accumulation. You get a record that's clinically outdated, has irrelevant patient information, and then that has lots of consequences on downstream clinicians. You get this extensive confusing documentation that leads to people who have pajama time with their least favorite EMR trying to clean up their notes outside of office hours. So the good news is that there has been movement to get more of a focus on medical decision-making in the coding system. And as Ken referenced, a big piece of that were the E&M coding changes that went into effect January 1st. You got to remember, CPT is greater than 50 years old. It, as a coding system, represents the structure that describes $1 trillion of annual healthcare spend. And the E&M portion of the code set, while it's a relatively small number of codes of the greater than 10,000 CPT codes, those are the most used to describe visits, and they haven't changed for almost 30 years until now. And when you think about when EHRs were built and adopted in that same 30-year time span, they built in a lot of documentation rules to support coding, which has led to note bloat and then all of the problems that I worry a lot about, like physician burnout. So the AIM has led a significant effort to change that portion of the code set, and that's gone into effect January 1. We think this is a good roadmap for continued E&M changes that can ultimately help us get to this goal of a reduction of documentation burden by 75%. And so, coding has a direct relationship to documentation. And you've got to remember that, CPT represents current medicine, and the overwhelming volume of changes that we see in CPT are in the areas of digital medicine, AI, and genomics as the third. So what has the AMA been doing to try to make this foundational system more open to innovators, entrepreneurs, and trying to improve what the end result on clinicians is? A couple of things. One, we put a digital front door to the CPT process. It's our CPT Smart App. It's intended to be open and transparent the entire process. But I hear all the time when I'm out talking to folks around the country that CPT still feels like a black box, even though it is an open process. So anyway, the Smart App is designed to be a digital front door to make it easier for folks to understand and access the process for these changes. The second thing we've done is by working with the innovator community. We've had a ton of input from stakeholders. The CPT editorial panel has made changes to the CPT process, accepting evidence and research from folks outside of the US, which is important, and other items that can significantly reduce the time and spend on getting innovation into production, which is often cited as a major barrier to adoption of solutions. And then finally, the last thing I'll say, and then I should probably turn it back over, is we've developed an AMA intelligent platform to provide the codes and other content through a set of modern technical approaches like APIs and portals to make sure that we've got rich content that can be delivered in computable forms that can be more easily ingested into innovative technology solutions. So the AMA is deeply committed to additional innovation. There's clearly, it is a roadmap beyond what's happened in 2021 with E&M coding visits. You've got to remember that the changes for the CMS guidelines really only impacted office and outpatient visits, but they haven't touched hospital inpatient services, nursing facility services, and another whole boatload of things. Finally, I loved that COVID presentation that Amanda, Eugene, and I apologize, I forgot the first woman who spoke's name was, but I got the same time my vaccination appointment opportunity email. The same day I got an email saying that we're going back to all of the pre-COVID documentation standards. So all of the things that we said we didn't really need to document because they weren't essential, that's been given up now. So while I got a ray of hope with my vaccine, a little bit of sadness with a backslide into pre-COVID documentation. So anyway, thanks for having me, Ken, and look forward to this discussion.
Fantastic. Moving on, Molly McCarthy, can you speak to what you're seeing in terms of the use of AI, artificial intelligence, to enhance the clinician-patient relationship and reduce the documentation burden? You heard from Jesse about a number of computable approaches. What's happening in what you're seeing around AI?
Great question, and definitely will try and do my best to stay within 3 minutes. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I wanted to say that, I've been in tech for a very long time, in healthcare for a long time, but I'm really a believer in people, process, and technology working together. And I think right now is is our time for as healthcare professionals and AI technologists to engage with each other to transform documentation, really from a more of a passive data entry process to more of an intelligent, insightful tool. So when I think about, and I know this was referenced during the survey a few minutes ago, but when I think about Dr. Sangstack and Dr. Adrian's conceptual framework on documentation burden that was published in June of 2020. Working at Microsoft is, a unique opportunity, and we're really working across all 6 domains to help create a truly patient-centered health system. But I specifically wanted to hone in on 2 of those aspects to really further our collective efforts towards providing better insights and better experiences and obviously better care. The first one is around usability and thinking about human factors engineering and the human computer interface principles. And this is something where, in terms of how we design and develop, really bringing in the feedback from both our partner ecosystem as well as our clinical community, and really to make it a more diverse and inclusive process. The second really is that 5th domain that they talk about around interoperability and standards through our Azure API for FHIR standards. And the other piece, just a couple of quick examples, just our cognitive services, and we'll hear more about these from one of our partners, Nuance, during the next session. But thinking about the health bot, and I know we just heard about digital front doors, and this has been something that's really been used over the past year, especially during COVID. The uptick was just incredible. Building that, it's an AI-powered conversational experience where you can, for example, with the CDC, we created the coronavirus self-assessment checker, and having that generated automatically onto their website. We actually have 7,000 instances of the health bot around the world. The second really is thinking about what more related to the question you asked me around AI tools for speech recognition, computer vision, language understanding. And again, I don't want to steal Peter's thunder from Nuance, but really thinking about how we can utilize ambient clinical intelligence to drive and to reduce that documentation, so natural language processing, et cetera, so that when a nurse or physician enters the room, they're having a conversation with the patient, with the family, that's being documented and captured, and they can go back through that at another point in time. And then the last piece I just want to mention is we recently launched text analytics for health. And just in case you are not writing all of this down, I will have the slides up on the website later, but it's really a process that helps health organizations take insights from unstructured medical data, which we know there's so much of, for example, in doctors' notes or nurses' notes, et cetera, publications, electronic, just the health records, to really enable them to look at and find different scenarios based on what they're seeing in the data. The other piece that I don't have time to touch on is just the replication and using machine learning to pick out other pieces of information that might also be documented. And so with that, I just want to kind of close out and say, we're really focused on maintaining that trust with the health community and empowering our health customers, in provider organizations and plan organizations, and really look forward to the continued conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Molly. So we've had laid out here from Jesse and Molly, first of all, workflow innovations in managing the complexity of E&M coding, and also technological innovations that may move us into a new interaction with the documentation technologies. So Marc, let's bring it down from this 35,000 foot view a little bit and get real. I know you've been investigating novel methods to ease the documentation burden, but I want to ask you about how we're going to know if those methods work. You've recently used EHR log data to characterize how much time physicians spend on documentation. And I know you're applying those methods to understand the impact of changes in documentation approaches. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we're going to bring this into the workflow in a way that's well evaluated?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the chance to be here. And I should share, sort of full disclosure, I recently took a role as the Chief Medical Information Officer at Anthem, one of the large health plans in the country. So just so people have that that caveat here. But 7 or 8 years ago, started down the road of some of the ambient kind of approaches that Molly was mentioning, using devices in the room, whether those were stethoscopes that were Bluetooth enabled, video cameras when doing video analysis, NLP and NLU and so on. But as part of that work, it was really became important to understand, well, what was the impact of these things? And that really led me down a trail, and now with colleagues from the AMA, Kathy Blake and Chris Sinsky and others, and Julie Evler-Milstein from UCSF, we've been fortunate to be able to launch a project that really is going to tackle the idea of how are those changes in CPT coding that Jesse described earlier making a difference or not. And the way we're approaching that is being both broad and deep. But in both cases, leveraging EHR log data as a core aspect of being able to measure longitudinally and at scale the impact of these changes. Now, you can equally well apply this to an innovation. Dr. Walls may talk in a minute about some of the things that Cerner is doing. Can we measure whether those things make a difference or not? Because obviously, lots of great ideas over the years, and we found out, well, didn't really make all the differences that we were hoping for. And so what we're doing is using data from a large EHR vendor to look across the country, measuring the time spent on documentation, when that time is spent, how that relates to the scheduled time in the visits and so on, with the goal of looking for, in a time series fashion, a reduction in the amount of time that providers are spent documenting. And one of the glories here is that because we're using long-term longitudinal data, we're able to look back from 2019 through 2020, where lots of time things are maybe a little bit different, and into 2021 and beyond as people adopt and incorporate these measures. And at the same time, looking deeply at one academic health center, UCSF, at those same kinds of things, those same kinds of measures, but they're having the luxury of having very deep knowledge of, are the providers well aware of these changes? How have they been educated? What are their attitudes towards them, and so on? So we're really excited about the potential to measure these outcomes and see the improvements over time.
Great. So we're going to have, from Marc, not surprisingly, data. Fantastic. So Eric, why have we not gone to notes generated by artificial intelligence and already achieved liberation from keyboards? What's holding us back?
Well, I think there's a lack of a will to do that. I think the problem is that these synthetic notes that have tremendous promise, and we've already seen examples of that, there's just not enough push on it. We have a bunch of startup companies. We have a few of the tech titans that have some interest, but it hasn't gotten to where it needs to be to achieve keyboard liberation. I do think that ultimately is the biggest early AI effect to improve the patient-doctor relationship, because without having to be data clerks, clinicians will be freed up to actually listen and have a presence with patients. And patients will appreciate that, of course, reciprocally. But the idea that we have the notes that are synthetically created through natural language processing and machine learning, edited by both the clinician and the patient, is still a work in progress. I've seen some of these notes. They're terrific. They're far better than the notes that exist today in charts. So I think we can do this, but it's going to take a push. It is, in my view, in the short term, the most exciting advance that we could do to alleviate what is a significant component of burnout for clinicians and what is a major point of disenchantment among patients. So I hope we'll be able to do that, and it isn't a priority at this time, and it should be.
Thank you. So I hear from you optimism about the technology, but shared frustration with all of us about where we still are today.
Right.
So Ross Koppel, you are our treasured skeptic of future technologies. And I want to ask you, while I know you agree with all of us that AI is going to offer many benefits that will undoubtedly get better and expand to other settings, there's also going to be problems that we can anticipate. I just want to remind the participants of this session. One of my favorite articles from Ross which was an early piece in JAMA on physician order entry that actually looked at all the kinds of mistakes you could make using an electronic order entry system that you would have never made on paper. Even though Ross agreed with all of us that moving away from paper had tremendous advantages. In the same vein, we're looking to Ross now to think ahead as to what the pitfalls are going to be as we go forward, because since, as Eric reminds us, we're not there yet, we have an opportunity to address these.
Good afternoon. Yes, Ken has asked me to be the curmudgeon. I must correct though, Ken, lest I irritate the two deans I'm in the schools of, he said ending with a preposition. I'm in the med school at Penn and at SUNY Buffalo, where I'm professor of medical informatics. Look, I have great faith that AI will get better, but there are, per request, issues. First, patient-clinician interaction. You know, there's so much ambiguity in what patients say. There's duplicity, denial. And I think experienced clinicians become skilled at identifying patients' problems, hesitancies, and in helping them to relate the truth. I doubt AI will be as good as we want in measuring the ambiguities and obfuscation and seeing the hand movements and the eye movements. Also, of course, clinicians will tell if there's a mother, a father, a lover in the same room, which AI may or may not pick. Second limitation, I think, was NLP, both in speech and text. And some of our fellow speakers have talked about some of the hysterical and horrible errors of voice recognition, failure to understand context, or confusion of synonyms and homonyms. Look, AI will get better, but the language is so fluid that ambiguity is tough. Third limitation, I think, is information integration. AI is miraculous at pulling information from myriad sources, and it will get better, but it has to be able to differentiate important, valid sources from wrong or distracting information. We have problems with that now. The last area, I think AI is brilliant at offering differential diagnoses, but my worry about that is that especially young physicians will become overly reliant on this AI function, especially as it gets better and better. And so we have this irony of technological improvement and dependence. But none of this, of course, should distract from my faith that AI will get better and EHRs offer so much, even though they are severely flawed compared to what we want. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ross. Now, So we've laid out some issues, and we'll spend a few minutes here talking among the panelists to dig in a little bit further. So Jesse, as you know, smart apps are near and dear to my heart. So I was very pleased to hear that the AMA solution involves one. Marc was working with us on that project since the very, very beginning, and then took that forward beautifully in the Cerner environment too. So we know there's a lot of promise there, but how do we know that your workflow innovations are going to actually improve the workflow for the very physicians you're representing and advocating for? What kind of processes do you envision happening to make sure that a workflow app that drives more efficient coding and billing is going to actually improve the plight of our physicians?
Thanks, that's a great question. And I think, to step back when we think about the work stream around how do we innovate, and I didn't get too much into the details, but we use a fairly open collaborative work group process around this work with some key objectives. Simplifying the work of the person who is doing the coding and documentation and improving the health of the patient. Those are the two foundational objectives with a set of guiding principles that then lead to what's focused on reducing administrative burden, reducing the need for audits, reducing unnecessary documentation that doesn't help patient care, and making sure that payment for what happens in E&M is resource-based and has no direct goal for payment redistribution between specialties, which is often something that we get tied up in. So when you think about achieving those objectives, how do you know if you get there? You have to measure it. And the collaboration that Marc was talking about in doing some really, I think, thoughtful work at scale to understand how these innovations actually work sort of in the field is a critically important part of closing the loop as this work and others moves forward.
That's great. And
Ken, if I could
please
build on that just a little bit, I think a couple of things. One is we often think of some of these technologies, whether it's speech or video analysis or whatever, as reducing the documentation burden, but I think they also help inform what Jesse was just talking about. CPT is a 50-year-old process with expert opinion. How much time should it take for XYZ? Well, we think it's 8 minutes. Okay, it's a good guess. We often don't know. And I think some of these technologies that we're talking about here can be leveraged to help feed this process. And while it's an open collaborative process, it's, I'll say, data poor, opinion rich. I don't mean that to be too critical, but I think we have the opportunity to really improve the data that we use to drive those processes. And I would say even more than that, and this gets a little bit to Eric and Ross's points about what AI can and can't do, is one of the things it begins to do is bring consistency. You talked about fraud and abuse and things like that, but it becomes more consistent now. The way that I document, or what comes out of my encounter with the patient, what comes out of your encounter with the patient, start to be more comparable and consistent and less gamed, which I'm a big fan of. So I think there's a lot of pieces here that converge and are pretty exciting.
So Marc, let me, I'll ask you to answer this briefly because I want to go all the way down to the 1 foot high level for a second. But I think it's interesting. So the ability to measure how physicians are spending their time in the electronic health record, as you pointed out, is often achieved through looking at these logs. But what methods can you use? And I've reviewed studies that use logs pretty carefully. And what methods do you use to make sure that when a physician's in the chart that and documenting, that you're not actually capturing also the time they ran off and coded a patient for 15 minutes and then came back?
No, it's a really important question. And frankly, in the review of some of the papers last year, that was like a lot of cycle time. And there's different approaches, of course. In a lot of the work that I've done to date has been using Cerner's data platform, Lights On. And what we built into that platform was a series of monitors. So it's actually looking at, well, are you clicking the mouse? Are you moving the mouse? Are you typing? And they're sort of, think about it this way, there's sort of a timeout. If you're sitting there and nothing is happening for 45 seconds from the computer standpoint, maybe you're looking at the screen for a while, but most of us don't have an attention span of 45 seconds, right? You know, we've gone away, we're answering a phone call, or we're sitting at home watching, you know, the commercial on the Super Bowl while we're doing notes or whatever it is. And so we've developed this notion of active time, which is, are you an active user? And that's one of the ways that we've tried to address that. And then Cerner did some really nice work early on before I started using this, actually validating that using video recordings of what's happening on the screen and direct observation. More to do there, I think, but I think that helps a lot with that problem of, are you an active user, or are you, you know, are you off, like you say, taking care of a patient in a different way?
One more in the weeds question. Are you using time motion studies or other validating sort of gold standards to look at whether an active user is an active user by those computable metrics, actually is an active user on the ground?
And that was absolutely done early on. And it's one of those things that's like, how many times do you have to do it, right? And I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like 300 providers over, you know, X jillion hours were observed early on, and the time motion compared.
Oh, right.
And then the other, I think, useful validation thing is, if you stack up time motion studies or random sampling time studies, or, you know, other kind of methodologies, and you start saying, well, you know, how do the results compare? And they start to look very similar. It increases your confidence. But it's a great question. You always have to worry about the techniques, and are you measuring what you think you're measuring?
Great. Eric, you know, you're looked to globally for directionality and where we should be going. What would be your first step in helping to, in advising a large health system in beginning to integrate AI into their documentation? What would you like to see happen early on to sort of to kindle that process?
Yeah, well, one thing that hasn't really been brought up so much is the role of the patient. I think that we have to get patients involved. They want to be involved. You know, we went through an era where, and still today, 2/3 of physicians won't give patients their notes from an encounter, which is incredible to me. This paternalism and the idea that the doctor owns the note, that he made the note, that it isn't the patient's property, is absurd. And so the editing of a synthetic note by a patient is important, I think, for those who are willing to do it. You know, it could be another person who is in the room, a family member, doesn't have to necessarily be the patient, but to make sure that it's accurate. And it also helps to, I think, increase the bond because now all the information is transparent and open. So I think that's the neglected part of this, is that machine learning for any physician, in the clinics where it's been tried, and it's mainly been done on a specialty basis, after 25, 30, 40 notes, you know, the voice recognition is good, but the patient involvement takes it to another level. So this whole idea that patients would be upset about notes is crazy. That's already been dispelled by Open Notes and My Notes programs. And all, as all of you know, whenever this was tested, there was a major turnaround among clinicians that, hey, this is a good thing, when they started out with a bias that it was bad. We need to open that up. So I hope the involvement of patients by a health system, I think it'll be gratifying. Obviously, you wouldn't do it at scale right away, but I think we need to explore that.
All right, fascinating. And yeah, Molly's raising her hand.
Yeah, no, I just want to
call on Molly next anyway to sort of pick up that baton.
Yeah, and you know, I started out the conversation really talking about people, process, and technology, and for a long time at Microsoft, a good 5 years, I was really beating the drum around virtual health and the concept of virtual visits. And just thinking about the technology across the patient journey and where we can insert it. It really took a pandemic, quite frankly, to move our medical community to adopting the virtual visit technology during last year. So I think I don't want to lose sight to what Dr. Topol talked about was one, the patient, but also he mentioned the paternalistic manner and culture in medicine, and it's incredibly prevalent. And I think that our goal, the technology is there. In fact, we launched Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare. The technology is embedded in our cloud. We're working with the EMR companies. I think one of the areas too that we're really working on is not just creating technology, but we obviously have a framework around ethics and bias, et cetera. And I know that's not this conversation, but that's a whole other bucket too, where clinicians might be reticent because of those factors. But I think it has to do a lot to do with culture, transformation, willing to make that investment and change, and then education and just even understanding what artificial intelligence in health is for physicians or nurses. I was at a conference a year and a half ago, an AI conference in cardiology. Actually, Dr. Topol, you may have been there. It was out in California, and really talking with cardiologists about their concerns around AI. So I think, again, it comes back to that people, process, and tech, and the tech is here. It's how ready are we to work together and partner to make those changes.
Great. Ross, you're a sociologist, an anthropologist, I would say. You tend to study in the studies I'm most familiar with, although I know actually you have a very broad base of research, but I'm most familiar with your studies of clinicians. But now as we bring patients into this joint production of the documentation, as Eric Topol pointed us towards, which is a fascinating advance. What are some of the pitfalls there, putting your curmudgeon hat back on?
Well, for one, there's the reluctance of doctors to be truthful, knowing that the patients will read it. And that screws up both the next clinician who needs to read the document and sometimes even the patient. But I know a psychiatrist who wanted to say the mother was in denial about her child's psychiatric problems. And because of open notes, she wrote, "The mother is taking a boat trip in Egypt." Denial. So the psychiatrist was being very clever, hoping that the next clinician would understand what the heck she was talking about. But it's scary because not everybody will catch those subtle clues. And then, of course, we have the usual sort of acronym hell of SOB, shortness of breath, and all of that. And even the very wording that we use, patient denies smoking. Patient denies child abuse. What? We don't write that. And so our very wording for this has to be fixed in terms of open notes that make sense for non-clinicians and for also providing the level of accuracy we all want. But there's another issue there, which is the other side. And Marc, you're now on the other side in a sense, which is the role of the payers in demanding certain levels of documentation, CMS being premier. And I wonder, just sitting here, will payers be using AI to help with the documentation burden, to reduce it? That's an opportunity we haven't looked at that is being raised by the conversation here.
So
just to say a little bit about that, the AMA, I think, took a great leadership role with CMS in changing their documentation requirements and are making a direct impact. We're seeing many private payers adopt those same documentation rules. So I really want to underscore how big a deal that is that the CMS and the AMA took that leadership.
Yeah, that's great. Marc, while you're activated here, as we discussed recently, I recall this quite provocative statement that you made a number of years ago, where you said we should videotape the doctor-patient history taking session, archive it, and document much less information than is there, and then retrieve that information in the rare circumstances when more information is needed. Have you changed your perspective, and what would be the advantages of actually kind of deprecating the importance of all the documentation that we do in terms of leading to better care?
Unlike so many things, it's kind of a thought experiment, right? What if you go to this extreme? What does the world look like? So no, I don't think I've changed in the sense of, I think that's a great thought experiment. What does that actually look like? So some of the work I did while I was at Cerner, for example, we used video in the room, tracking things. Well, golly, privacy, big worry, right? Nobody wants their hair to be, or Ross and I, have other worries, but or the pelvic exam, or whatever it is. And so what we did, for example, and this is where technology really comes into play, is we reduced that data, instead of a video, to stick figures. Many of you may have seen the Microsoft Connect kind of little figures. Thank you, Molly. You can take credit for everything Microsoft does, right? But okay, well, now that's a little less scary, right? And in fact, what we did in that pilot was we displayed those in the room as the patient was getting their care, so they knew exactly what was being tracked and recorded, and things like that. So I think there's work to do to take that concept and turn it into something that can be used. But the other thing that is really important is there's obviously key bits of data from that encounter that we need to capture. And whether that's through NLU or through image processing of your Bluetooth-enabled otoscope images or whatever it is, there's data that you clearly want to capture as structured data in real time. And some of that can be facilitated by AI, some of that's the smart clinician. And there's also other things that have to come in. So no, I haven't changed the position, but I think we've got a ways to go before we can really realize that. But it's less about, I think it's more work to do. I don't think there's any fundamental technologic breakthroughs needed.
Thank you. So, I see Ross raising his two fingers.
2 points. One, who the hell has time to go look through previous, doctor-patient interactions and spend that time doing that? The answer is almost no one. So recording it may be brilliant, and use of AI to interpret it may be brilliant, but there's still a hell of a lot of time requirement in going through that. And the second point is, we have to allow clinicians a place to write their thoughts about something they want to think about. And we have to have that excluded from the eyes of everyone, including AI and the patient. I mean, you're allowed to write on the margins, cancer ? Abuse ? And then have it confirmed that it's not that issue. But we can't prohibit clinicians from having the right to make their own notes and have that protected.
And Ross, just a quick response there is, there are great technologies. Now, you don't have to sit and watch the entire encounter. You can say, I wanted to find the diabetes things. And it's amazing the work that's been done in the educational domain with this, with lectures and so on. It's very feasible now, just as we might go in and search for diabetes and we get data about the drug and about the dose of insulin that they had filled, also to get the link to, here's the 7-second snippet of the video where you talked about that with the patient last week.
Right.
Fantastic. All right, as promised, and just about on time, I'm going to now turn this conversation over to questions and comments to expand upon from the participants. So I'm going to start with one from a very well-informed participant, Paul Tang, who put into the chat. And I'm going to ask for volunteers from the panel to respond to this, and more than one of you certainly may. In the old days of paper records, we used the time and the effort of writing a progress note to synthesize what we know and to share our thought processes of where we're headed for diagnosis and treatment for ourselves and others. We would miss that synthetic communication function in an automated documentation from ambient utterances. So it would take the thought out of our sort of summative evaluation of the patient. And Paul also says, on the flip side, when we forage through the EHR, what we're looking for are insights, not pieces of data. We should use AI to glean insights from the written documentation. So on the one hand, are we removing the thought process? Are we ironically, well, even though potentially giving, what I like about Paul's question is it flips this on its head. In other words, we're trying to give docs more time because we took away their time. And Jesse's term, pajama time, is really one of those powerful images that reminds us what's happened to the lives of doctors. At the same time, are we going to just increase doctors' efficiencies so that we expect them once again to have a very high throughput and remove even more of their thinking time? And so let me throw that out there to the group. Who would like to respond?
You know, a thought that comes to mind is what are you replacing and what are you taking out, right? And so somebody in the chat that I've been seeing like fly by talked about, you know, a word that we at the AMA really like, which is augmenting, right? It's augmenting the note. And so if you take that a step further, don't replace the medical decision-making, the synthesizing, by just having the AI system do the documentation. You augment it, and there could potentially be AI-driven insights that could help with that medical decision-making beyond just capturing, you know, Marc's physical exam.
I just want to point out
chime in here too around
Tanya and early Greek philosophers. There's always that comment, I write so that I can think. And the idea of synthesizing the note that, you know, you guys have raised here, synthesizing your thoughts to the note is lost if we think that everything magically is put into via the technology.
Molly.
A couple of things. One, you know, for me in technology, you know, if you look here, I have my written notes. I don't take notes on the computer, and I really enjoy the process of writing. So I would agree with, I forget who asked that question, but there is a process that happens when you physically write versus type. But I do agree, you know, when I say the term AI, although we mean artificial intelligence as an umbrella term, really what we're looking for are actionable insights so that we can provide our clinicians with that information, whether it's a nurse, a physical therapist, you know, the unit secretary, the pharmacist, with the right information, you know, about the right patient at the right time, thinking about it that way. So, you know, I'd have to agree in that it's, you know, it's not just tech for tech's sake, but really driving clinicians to better more informed, evidence-based decision-making. You know, I spoke with a health system, a large health system that said, you know, they had 200 billion text messages per year, which included alerts and broadcast messages. And the nurse was interrupted every 30 to 45 seconds with information. So how can we provide that nurse or physician with that information so that they're not being interrupted, so that they can either continue their documentation or really spending time with that patient? And so those are some of the problems that we're seeing as a tech company, and really working through an overall strategy for documentation across the system.
And so, Eric, is this potential threat to the thinking time or the thinking processes of physicians as we know it now a threat to deep medicine?
Yes, I mean, I think the problem is we need more thinking time. And that's why a lot of tests are being ordered and mistakes are being made. And so the idea here is, of course, to get more things done in a different manner, that is more autonomy. This is a big part of what's neglected with AI is patient-generated data and algorithms to support initial screening of diagnoses. And we're seeing that evolve now with things like diagnosis of urinary tract infections, which is now possible in other countries. We're seeing it with skin lesions and ear infections in children. We've already seen it with atrial fibrillation through a smartwatch and things like that. So there's a lot of things that would decompress so there'd be more time. We need time. The gift of time is the most essential component of that interaction, which has been compromised more and more over the years. So thinking time, as Danielle Ofri has emphasized in her writings, is the most critical thing we can get to stop the wastage of testing and procedures and get a lot more accuracy, even without algorithmic support of physicians. It's just time is a critical element.
So Rob, yeah, how do we know, I see you're about to talk, how do we know when we've designed a system that's giving people a room to think? Answer as a sociologist.
Well, we desperately need AI to filter the avalanche of information that would be coming from the smartwatches and smart toilets and all of that. Without AI, we're dead. But do we trust the AI to know the one sort of, and by the way, I found a lump, it has to catch that. And if there's 50,000 messages that are being sent, we're dependent on the AI because we're flooded by all of these brilliant technologies. And we need to give that information in such a way that it allows the clinician time to think, exactly as Eric says.
So Marc, you revealed, and congratulations, that you are a member of the private payer world now. And so that's really where we could see some real forcing functions on these processes. How would you start to imagine reimbursing for thought that yields better outcomes over, for example, volume that may not? Uh-oh. Marc, you're a little frozen. Okay, while Marc unfreezes, I'm going to remind.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, are you back? Sort of. Hang on just for 1 second, Marc. So I'm going to remind folks, I've been trying to follow the chat, and Kevin Johnson warned us early that the chat would be overwhelming. And I have to say, this is the most active chat I've ever seen on a Zoom. So I'm trying to extract some questions from a lot of brilliant comments that are going by. But if anyone would like to actually ask a question, put it in the chat and I'll try to monitor it for the next few minutes. We have about 13 minutes left in this session. So let me now ask a slightly different question that did come from our participants. And that has to do with the importance of generating notes across transitions of care. And are there, let me start with Molly, are there questions about, are there approaches in AI and in Microsoft solutions that might help us have more integrated notes that really fully appreciate the patient's journey around town, at least to different sites in healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think, when I mentioned earlier around interoperability, that's critical, I think, for synthesizing all the information and data into one place. But we created Azure API for FHIR really to manage health data in the cloud, to be able to have it transported from site to site, quite frankly. There are a lot of complications and challenges around that in terms of, I think even from a patient experience perspective, having data in multiple portals, for example. I'd love to see, that aggregated into one, electronic health record, quite frankly, from a management perspective. So I'm just wondering, as we think about that and even the future of value-based care and care management, bringing those systems together. And I know some recent legislation that's gone into effect around that, but that's our goal, creating at Microsoft a system that's interconnected, whether the patient's, in a clinic or if the patient's at home, and especially at home, quite frankly, because that's where I feel like we need more connected care. Where we were talking about video earlier, where videos had a huge impact on helping, either through virtual health or telemedicine visits, helping to triage our patients. We have a program with babies with heart defects at hospitals I think we started at Children's Mercy, but having the ability for the parents to submit data remotely and have it automatically aggregated into the patient records and helping the clinicians make decisions. So long answer, definitely. It's something that we look for at Microsoft and really having that connected care system, regardless of where the patient is in their journey.
Great. Let me pass the baton to Eric and ask a question from the audience. Is there a role for technology in helping to adjudicate conflicting information sources that are coming in from Molly's integrated approaches?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Well, when it comes to AI, there's a solution for everything, including all the problems that AI generates. But, I think adversarial GANs are a way to get at that. So, yeah, there's always a solution. Is it valid? That's another question. Then to be explored.
To follow up on that, Ken, I think you were going to ask Marc when he cut out from us a question about being on the payer side, maybe related to burden. And I immediately think about prior authorization, which is something that is just a thorn in every clinician's side. And I have in my mind this battle of, the AIs, right? It's the AI helping me as a clinician get the services I think my patient needs, make sure the note's complete, it's got the right documentation, versus Marc's AI that is trying to do the things to potentially reduce their exposure and need for payment and coverage. How do we get things where those things are synergistically working together, not against each other, is something that philosophically I don't think we have quite resolved, but maybe Marc wants to comment.
Yeah, I think that's part of our journey towards value-based care, right? Of we should all be headed in the same direction. And I love, the Brent James theory that quality and cost are two sides of the same coin, and high quality care and it's low cost care at the end of the day. And so I don't think that they should necessarily be conflicting, but I agree there's risk there. There's going to be periods of time where people are fighting the battles. It's like the $25,000 book on Amazon where, the algorithms for pricing drove the price of this out of print book up over the matter of hours. So there's certainly risks there.
I think one of the issues with coordinating this is the different formats that the different systems have for writing prescriptions, for writing information. We're in, a sort of data standard hell of this range of ways of recording information, and that can really mess us up. I hope AI will be able to, spelunk through the various forms of data to help us with that.
If I can just follow up on that, we need a common semantic framework that encodes knowledge as a base to allow knowledge development. And you think about as we move into digital health, we've got all of this traditional knowledge that's not in a computable form. And figuring out how we can do that is important. There's pilot work at the AMA, our clinical knowledge graph project, that sort of is trying to take that vision forward. And certainly I think we'll hear from the next panel some of those other projects that are in flight on the industry side as well.
Great. So let me ask to Eric, how do we teach students to begin to use these systems and to document well? How should we be indoctrinating the youngest members of our medical culture?
Yeah, it's a really important direction we need to go. They need to understand at least the basics and the nuances. There's some online courses that are starting to get set up. Certainly, Pierce Keane in the UK is working on that for both medical students and physicians. And there have been some reports of just giving, whether it's trainees or young physicians in practice, experience working with medical images and just getting some firsthand experience. I think these are some really good ways to get grounding, which is all you really need just to get started.
Yeah, we at Microsoft, I think I put in the chat earlier, as I talked about people, process, and technology, really interested in working with different organizations around education. We launched earlier this fall an AI and health course called Leading Through Change. It actually provides contact hours for nurses and physicians to provide those foundations, and it can be used in schools as well. The other thing that I feel really strongly about, because I've done a lot of guest lecturing in undergraduate nursing programs more recently, is just the lack of courses around this, obviously. But quite frankly, this is a group that's very tech savvy. They've grown up with it. So I think that they're ripe for instruction around this. And one of the things that we've also done, we launched last year in partnership with Johnson & Johnson, that I'm really passionate about, is bringing nurses and clinicians into the design and development process. And so we launched a Nurse Hack for Health series, and we were specifically looking at applications that would help with the pandemic response. We have one coming up in May where we're looking more around vaccine management and education. But I think it's important as a tech company really to fold in that point of view into how we create and marry up our clinicians with our developers so they understand each other's point of view. And it's been incredibly rewarding and successful. So I encourage everybody, if you haven't attended a hackathon, whether it's, for whatever purposes, it's really a neat way to come together, whether you're a student or current clinician.
And Ken, the AMA, we've invested heavily through our Change Med Ed program in a 32 medical school consortium around the country to do things like help folks understand, how do we get common competencies in the informatics space as it relates to, how do you interact with these EHR systems? And Bill Hirsch and I wrote a chapter for our health system science textbooks that's now being widely used and has driven a lot of that. I know many folks on this call, I'm sure from the AMA side, have been involved in those conversations as well. But that's one way that the AMA is trying to figure out, how do we get those concepts that often get sort of frozen in the informatics community out at scale across, the 100,000 students who are in training today, so that when they graduate, they can help move this all forward.
That's great. That's great. Marc, thinking outside the box for a moment, is there a way to teach students to help AI be better? Pilots, for example, have a much more constrained vocabulary than physicians, and that presumably improves communication with the control tower, et cetera. Do we need to be as expressive as we are, or could we, in as many varied ways, or could we teach students to be even more regimented, and that would really give a boost to the accuracy of our AI algorithms in interpreting what they say?
Yeah, and I think one of the places and I never quite got there, that I thought would be a great place to both develop these things and provide some of this kind of training role is we have these wonderful simulation centers. And I think somebody mentioned this in the chats.
They did.
And we have these wonderful clinical training exercises that are relatively standardized, right? You have, like at IU School of Medicine, there's several hundred students every year go through the same several dozen patients in simulations. What a phenomenal opportunity to get data for training and so on, sort of bidirectionally. So, so I think that is a great opportunity, and I don't know that anybody has really capitalized on that yet. Maybe somebody's doing that right now, but I think there's great opportunity there, and obviously that would bring to the students, some standardized opportunity and feedback. But yeah, I think there's great potential there.
All right. So here we are coming to the end of this session. We covered a wide-ranging set of issues and topics, suggestions for the future, and looks at what some of the most innovative folks here represented here on this panel are doing. What I would encourage us to do is to keep those ideas in mind as and layer them over your reaction to a bunch of real world solutions that are emerging now that we're going to see in the next panel, the industry panel discussion. What are the solutions coming out of industry? So with that, I will ask.
Ken, I just want to thank you and everybody. This has been spectacular. So thank you all very much for this first session. It's been great.
Thank you, Don. And thank you, panelists. And for spending time on a Friday afternoon with us.